to suggest to us that to be well in a troubled world is to be right here today with your Thoreauvian counterparts. I'm delighted that we're here. I'm going to turn it over to John in a moment, but a housekeeping note. The last program of the day will swap rooms. Chapel comes here, and the program scheduled for this room moves to the chapel. And those are the economic health moves to the chapel, joy and despair moves into this room. And again, good morning.
All right. Thank you, Court. Welcome all. We'll get the echo worked out for our presenters, we promise. Let me just, I'll slow it way down. Fingers crossed. Welcome again to our 85th gathering on the hottest day of the week. We're happy to be in the beautiful Trinity Episcopal air-conditioned church hall. And what a wonderful programs we had yesterday, thinking about health from a couple really powerfully different lenses. I was very much struck by the panel on critical health, on the balance between I have to use the mic because we have remote viewers, so apologies. I think my sense is once we'll have Xiujuan share, we can cut off the remote and we'll be fine. So I'll be very brief. Okay. So I'll can my remarks and get right to our panel. Yeah, we'll be okay. Our panel for this morning is Thoreau and spiritual health. And we have 4 presenters coming from across the world. Our first, joining us from China, if you can wave, Xiujuan. She's a lecturer at Zhenjiang University in China and a recipient of the 3rd annual Thoreau Society Short-Term Research Fellowship in 2014, and an avid member of the society, and part of the world where Thoreau has taken root in exciting ways in the past decades. Richard Smith, in person here, is a public historian who has written or edited 11 books for Applewood Books and Arcadia Publishing, and recently retired from a 20-plus year portraying Henry Thoreau in many venues, and now is free to grow his hair as long as he wants. Barry Andrews, on your left of the table, is a retired Unitarian Universalist minister, independent scholar, and lifetime member of the Thoreau Society, and the author of a number of really wonderful books on using Transcendentalist as a guide for our own spiritual practice. And we are very excited to welcome Thomas More in the center of the table, the author of the best-selling Care of the Soul, which spent 44 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list some time ago, and more than 30 other books translated into 35 languages. A former Catholic monk with a PhD in religious studies from Syracuse University, he writes and lectures internationally on living a soulful life. His latest book, The Cure at Walden Pond, just published in 2026, offers reflections inspired by Henry David Thoreau. We'll have copies for sale on Saturday, and we'll have Thomas back in the fall for a special event focused on that book. We are delighted to have all the panelists. We'll start with Xiujuan, who will share remotely, and we'll have each presenter come to the podium, and we'll have questions at the end. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, and good evening and good morning Everyone say hello from China. Now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so can you see my PowerPoint? Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be here. It's such a long time. So today, the title of my presentation is Like Corn in the Night on Thoreau's Goods of the Soul. This is my contents. Introduction from Aristotle to Thoreau. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle states the goods are the ends, which could be attainable by ordinary people. Among the goods, external goods or goods of property and goods of the body, goods of the soul is concerned with the consistency between deeds and minds. That is, one should exercise activities correctly by reason or the rational parts of the soul instead of the non-rational parts. Okay. Together with other goods, Aristotle argues one can eventually achieve eudaimonia, which is equivalent to flourishing and well-being. In conceptualizing eudaimonia and goods, Aristotle encourages people to make their lives good. In Aristotle's words, what really matter for happiness are activities in accordance with virtue, and for the contrary of happiness, the contrary kinds of activities. Echoing Aristotle's thinking, Thoreau also cultivates himself to attain eudaimonia. In terms of Thoreau's goods of the soul, he's more concerned with one's immersive experiences in nature, especially untamed wilderness. In order to have these experiences, Thoreau practices his ethics of relinquishment, hoping to establish a profound kinship with nature. In the process, he also has the experience of understanding his own epistemological limitations. Nevertheless, he enjoys the moments of self-transcendence and ecstasies, both of which contributes to his goods of the soul. The question is this: why does Thoreau want to develop his goods of the soul? Part 1, Critique of Material Culture. The mass of men leads lives of quiet desperation. The genesis of Thoreau's cultivation of his goods of the soul is closely derived from his critique of material culture in his time. In his diagnosis of the state of living for most people, he states, quote, "The mass of men leads lives of quiet desperation," end quote. This quiet desperation stems from a society obsessed with the relentless accumulation of material property. It is nothing wrong with the act of accumulation, but it would be problematic when one gives up the nurture of his or her soul for the sake of material accumulation. In Thoreau's words, most men, even in this comparatively free country, through mere ignorance and mistake, are so occupied with the fastidious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its final fruits cannot be plucked by them. Their fingers from excessive toil are too clumsy and tremble too much for that, end quote. As he observes, people are now sacrificing their health and blindly following the social trends of material wealth, which is metaphorically described as catechism. Obviously, in a satirical tone, Thoreau points out people justify their fetishism of material wealth by twisting the sacred meanings of God. Beneath their wrong and superficial understanding of the ends of life, they have no idea what they would end up. Okay. In contrast to the tradition of following a powerful, angry God, as Jonathan Edwards preaches, Thoreau decides to find a new path of life. He chooses to transcend the empirical experiences of sluggishness in thoughts and to seek an independent path of ethical living. Here are his words: "Let us settle ourselves, etc." in his strong determination of establishing the point d'appui, as he states here, or a point of support, Thoreau imagines optimistically he will deconstruct the illusion of supremacy of materialism. Then he would construct a new ethical foundation according to which the flourishing of his soul helps him to live a worthy life because he has spent his precious lifetime in pursuit of the ethical truths instead of quotes, shams and appearances, end quotes, were rather accumulating the worthless material property. In other words, his goods of the soul is characterized as his intellectual independence, spiritual depth, and aesthetic sensitivity. The question is thus, how would he act for his goods? Part 2. Immersive experiences as the means to the goods of the soul, like corn in the night. Thoreau's means for his goods of the soul is to establish an interconnected relationship between himself and nature. In order to achieve this purpose, he would like to practice the idea of voluntary poverty. Here, voluntary poverty carries three intertwined dimensions: epistemological, ethical, and spiritual. Epistemologically, it
So we're afraid it's Xiaojuan's connection in China. We'll see if it'll reboot in a moment. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next presentation and see if we can get her back. We will stop the sharing of Xiaojuan's presentation and see if we can get her back. And I think our mic is now getting rebooted.
Very involved with all of the conquered people. And he particularly was, I think, one of the few people in the 19th century that actually understood Thoreau and what Thoreau was trying to do with his writing. And he would later write that Walden was the only book, only American book, that deserved an annual reading. And so I think that he absolutely understood everything that Thoreau was trying to do. So During his long life, Thomas Wentworth Higginson was a Unitarian minister, a transcendentalist, and an abolitionist, as well as a writer, poet, editor, literary critic, and women's rights activist. In the Civil War, he was the colonel of one of the first all-Black Union regiments, the 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, which was made up of formerly enslaved people. He was severely wounded during the war, leading to his retirement from the Army in 1864. He seemed to know anyone and everyone in the worlds of literature and reform, and he counted among his closest friends Lucy Stone, John Greenleaf Whittier, James Fields, Lydia Maria Child, Theodore Parker, and Margaret Fuller. While some of his other friends and acquaintances included William Lloyd Garrison, Susan B. Anthony, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, and Charles Darwin. He was a friend and lifelong admirer of both Emerson and Thoreau. As a minister, he was especially influenced by Emerson. As a radical Unitarian minister, he transformed transcendentalist philosophy into militant social activism. Rather than just contemplating nature and the soul, he championed immediate abolitionism, women's rights, and the physical liberation of enslaved people. He was also a member of the Secret Six, the small group of supporters who gave John Brown the money and weapons for the raid on Harper's Ferry. Writing to Brown in 1858, quote, "I am always ready to invest money in treason." I actually have a tattoo of that. Higginson was the only one of the six who didn't flee the country or deny his involvement with Brown after Brown was captured in 1859. He personally raised money after Brown's execution for Brown's widow and children. He traveled to Europe 3 times, including the Azores, spending the winter of 1855-1856 there. He published over 25 books and wrote some 500 essays, most of which appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. Higginson was a leading pioneer of the American physical cultural movement, championing the gymnasium as a tool to, quote, "build moral muscles." He believed rigorous bodily fitness was essential for building both personal character and a more muscular, active society. He was one of America's foremost proponents of muscular Christianity, a religious and social movement that promoted physical vigor, athleticism, and manly virtues as an expression of Christian faith. Originating in Victorian England, it sought to counter meek piety and redefine the church as a robust, active force by linking spiritual health with physical discipline. Higginson argued that physical health was a prerequisite for success and that a robust strength directly supported moral and ethical action. While living in Worcester in the 1850s, he became a vocal promoter of the local gymnasium. He organized a boating club for young men and women and was a strong advocate for making gymnastics and sports a foundational part of American life. His most famous exploration of this topic was his 1858 essay for The Atlantic called "Saints and Their Bodies." In it, he critiqued early aesthetics for being ashamed of their bodies and lamented that past saints had strong minds but exhausted, sickly bodies. And he called for a cultural shift to value physical discipline. He urged Americans to embrace gymnastics, swimming, and outdoor exercise to achieve well-balanced, ethically conditioned lives. He argued that the mind and soul are heavily dependent on the condition of the physical body, and championed the great outdoors, athletics, and exercise as mandatory for a truly complete and effective life. Quote, "Everybody admires the physical training of military and naval schools, but these same persons never seem to imagine that the body is worth cultivating for any purpose except to annihilate the bodies of others. Yet it needs more training to preserve life than to destroy it. The vocation of the literary man is far more perilous than that of the frontier dragoon. The latter dies at most but once by an Indian bullet. The former dies daily unless he be warned in time and take occasional refuge in the saddle and the prairie with the dragoon." Quote, "Physical health is a necessary condition of all permanent success. To the American people, it has a stupendous importance because it is the only attribute of power in which they are losing ground. Guarantee us against physical degeneracy, and we can risk all other perils: financial crisis, slavery, Romanism, that's Catholics, Mormonism, border ruffians, and New York assassins. Domestic malice, foreign levy, nothing can daunt us. Guarantee us health, and Mrs. Stowe cannot frighten us with all the prophecies of Dred Scott. But when her sister Catherine informs us that in all the vast female acquaintance of the Beecher family, there are not a dozen healthy women, we confess ourselves a little tempted to despair of the Republic. Some of the things that he openly advocated was swimming. He particularly emphasized this as one of the best whole body exercises and activities, and he would swim in the Charles River. Gymnastics, of course, he was a regular gym goer, and he recommended the gymnasium for overall physical discipline. Rowing, he endorsed a classic, rugged physical discipline of actually rowing, again, on the Charles River. He encouraged field sports, including baseball, cricket, and football. And he also suggested boxing, sailing, bowling, and skating for Americans to be involved in. Now, while masculine Christianity focused primarily on masculinity, Higginson strongly advocated physical exercise and gymnastics for women as well. He believed that traditional expectations of female frailty were unnatural, and that robust physical training was essential for women's overall health, emancipation, and equality. He championed women's physical culture through several key arguments and actions. As I said, he critiqued the idea of female frailty. He observed that many American women suffered from poor health and enfeebled bodies due to indoor lifestyles, restrictive corsets, and sedentary cultural expectations. He pushed for the end of the, quote, fragile white-faced model of femininity. In 1862, again in the Atlantic, he published an article called The Health of Our Girls, and he specifically addressed the physical development of young women. He argued that girls should be encouraged to run, play, and engage in outdoor exercise. Later in his life, particularly in his 1881 book, Common Sense About Women, Higginson compiled essays promoting women's physical capabilities, arguing that women had the right and the need to be just as active and strong as men. Now, he didn't just advocate for weightlifting and gymnastics, he also disapproved of alcohol and tobacco, recognizing early on the connections between lifestyle and long-term health. Alongside his advocacy for women's rights and the abolition of slavery, he worked passionately for the temperance movement, which drew considerable attention during his early ministerial career in Massachusetts, and he frequently integrated warnings about tobacco and liquor into his sermons. In his prolific essay writing, he promoted voluntary abstinence and health. Now, he practiced what he preached. A temperance man his entire life. He never drank, he never smoked. In later years, he could be seen on his tricycle with his small daughter, Margaret, riding up and down the streets of Cambridge. Born on December 22, 1823, he died there on May 9th, 1911, at the age of 87. He believed a strong, active body was necessary to combat the era's bloodless, over-intellectualized culture, and that the robust physical health was required to build the energy and stamina needed to fight societal injustices, including slavery and the lack of women's rights. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was living proof in his belief that morally, intellectually, culturally, and spiritually, quote, physical health is a necessary condition of all permanent success. Thank you very much.
Good morning. In September of 1851, Thoreau made the following entry in his journal. The art of life. Was there anything memorable written upon it? By what disciplines to secure the most life? With what care to watch our thoughts? To observe not what transpires in the street, but in the mind and heart of me? I do not remember any page which will tell me how to spend this afternoon. If he hadn't yet found anything memorable written on the art of life, it wasn't for lack of trying. His earliest education was in the classical literature of Greece and Rome. While a student at Harvard, he read works by the Stoics, Seneca and Cicero, and the writings of Horace and Plutarch, who espoused similar views. He also read a number of anthologies of classical literature in which he would have encountered Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. Even if his knowledge of these schools of philosophy was limited, it is clear that Thoreau shared a similar outlook on life. For instance, in the economy chapter of Walden, he describes our habitual existence as one of ceaseless toil, burdened by debt and the pressures of conformity. The mass of men live lives of quiet desperation, he insists. They have no time for leisure necessary for peace of mind and the cultivation of the soul. The remedy he prescribes for this dis-ease combines elements of both Epicureanism and Stoicism. Like the Epicureans, he advocates simple living. When we have secured the necessities of life, food, shelter, clothing, and warmth, there is another alternative than to obtain these superfluities, he writes, and that is to adventure on life now, our vacation from humbler toil having commenced. And like the Stoics, he seeks serenity through harmony with nature, as described in a passage from the chapter Solitude. This is a delicious evening when the whole body is one sense and imbibes delight through every pore. I go and come with a strange liberty in nature, a part of herself. The spiritual exercises Thoreau engages in are also in accord with those of the Stoics and Epicureans. Reading, solitude, contemplation, proper diet, journal keeping, walks in nature, and the pursuit of leisure. Such practices are intended to achieve awareness, transcend the ego, and transform the self. We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, he writes, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. Finally, he describes transcendence both in terms of cosmic consciousness and the eternity of the present moment, sometimes in the same passage as in this example. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. Drawing upon Emerson's extensive library of ancient and modern wisdom, Thoreau was introduced to the spiritual writings of India, China, and the Middle East. There are several reasons why this literature appealed to him. For one thing, the spiritual traditions of India and China seemed ancient, more so in the case of India than China. But in either case, it was wisdom handed down from an earlier time, closer to the origins of philosophy and religion, and therefore more authentic in a way. Taken together with the philosophies of classical Greece and Rome, they embodied wisdom that was both perennial and universal. At Emerson's invitation, he contributed to a section of the Dial magazine featuring ethnical scriptures, quotations taken from various philosophical and religious traditions. These included passages from the Laws of Menu, Sayings of Confucius, and the Chinese Four Books. The Laws of Menu, with the gloss of Kaluka, was one of the first Hindu texts Thoreau read. The selections he chose dealt primarily with the education and training of the Brahmin priesthood. Brahmins are told how to eat their food, how to conduct sacrifices, how to treat their bodies, and whom to marry. And they are advised to abandon all earthly attachments, to withdraw from the world, to seek solitude, and to practice meditation. His next selection of ethnical scriptures was taken from the Analects of Confucius, translated by Joshua Marshman in 1836, and from the Phoenix, a collection of old and rare fragments published in 1835. These selections depict the proper conduct of would-be followers of Confucius. Some of them, like those taken from the laws of Menu, prescribe certain types of behavior. Others offer ethical advice more generally. Another group of selections was taken from the 4 books of Confucian literature: the Analects of Confucius, the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, and the Book of Mencius. The last 3 of these books reflect the teachings of the Neo-Confucian tradition that arose some 1,300 years after Confucius. Some of these selections have primarily to do with the cultivation of virtue, while others deal with rules for proper conduct. All of them relate to the notion of the superior man, namely a person exhibiting virtue and moral excellence. So why did he choose these particular extracts? To understand the meaning of these groups of selections and why Thoreau chose them, we need to view them in the context of what he says about philosophers in the opening chapter of Walden. There are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers, he writes. To be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, nor even to found a school, but to so love wisdom as to live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. It is to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically. He likens professors of philosophy to courtiers who make shift to live merely by conformity. The true philosopher is not fed, sheltered, clothed, warmed like his contemporaries, but maintains his vital heat by better methods than other men. The better methods he alludes to amount to a spiritual practice that he developed and described under the rubric of self-culture, not only in Walden, but throughout his essays, journal, and letters. Thoreau views the ancient philosophers, Chinese, Hindu, Persian, and Greek, as proponents of philosophy as a way of life. The selections chosen for the ethnical scriptures offer examples of what might be termed self-cultivation philosophies. Such philosophies share 2 general characteristics. First of all, they promote a cultivation of the self that is radically different from ordinary concepts of the self. Secondly, such philosophies have a practical orientation in teaching their followers how to live the good life. More specifically, there is a 4-fold pattern typical of these philosophies. They begin with a baseline understanding of human nature. They conclude that the existential condition of human beings is problematic. They posit an ideal state of being, often the opposite of our present unsatisfactory condition, that we should aspire to attain. And finally, they prescribe a spiritual regimen designed to achieve a transformation of the self. We can see this pattern in the writings of the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome. One of the foremost authorities on these philosophies is Pierre Hadot, author of Philosophy as a Way of Life. He stresses the point that in antiquity, to be a philosopher meant living a philosophical life rather than engaging in abstract theoretical discourse. The philosophical life was achieved by means of spiritual exercises. According to Hadot, in all philosophical schools, the goal pursued in these exercises is self-realization and improvement. All schools agree that man, before his philosophical conversion, is in a state of unhappy disquiet, consumed by worries, torn by passions. He does not live a genuine life. nor is he truly himself. All schools also agree that man can be delivered from this state. Philosophy is an art of living that alleviates suffering by teaching a radically new way of life. Thoreau's notion of self-culture has affinities with Indian and Chinese philosophies of self-cultivation also. Generally speaking, the Hindu texts he read follow the patterns of self-cultivation philosophies. Human beings suffer and feel pain, caused on the one hand by desires, and on the other by a misapprehension of the true nature of reality. Liberation, or freedom from suffering, therefore depends upon stifling desires and dispelling the illusions that keep us trapped in a desperate condition. Those seeking release are advised to engage in spiritual practices known as yogas. These may include physical exercises, austerities of various kinds, mental concentration, the performance of certain rituals, and the study of sacred scriptures. Thoreau didn't study the Chinese classics to the same extent that he did the Hindu scriptures. Thus, it's difficult to know how much his understanding of this literature contributed to his own philosophy. Nevertheless, self-cultivation was central to Confucianism. Like other self-cultivation philosophies, it emphasized practice over theory. In particular, it focused on becoming a moral person. The concept of virtue, how one develops and exhibits it, played a central role in this regard. Virtue had an ethical dimension, but it was also a form of personal power or influence. The epitome of Confucian self-cultivation was the sage, a person who internalized and exhibited virtue. In November 1837, at the outset of his own spiritual journey, Thoreau wrote in his journal, "My desire is to know what I have lived, that I may know how to live henceforth." The conduct of life is a common theme in all of his writing. He was drawn to the spiritual traditions and philosophical schools of thought that promoted his own self-cultivation. I would not argue that any one of these or any combination of them necessarily shaped his own views. He, like his transcendentalist colleagues, believed that such teachings represent a form of perennial wisdom, just as true today as it was in ancient times. In this literature, they found inspiration, guidance, and a confirmation of their own intuitions. Self-culture, after all, was a defining characteristic of transcendentalist spirituality. Reading was an essential practice, along with the embrace of a wide-ranging religious cosmopolitanism. In the reading chapter of Walden, Thoreau envisions gathering the literature of all these traditions in one vast library. That age will be rich indeed when those relics which we call classics and the still older and more than classic but even less well-known scriptures of the nations shall have further accumulated, when the Vatican shall be filled with Vedas and Zendavestas and Bibles, with Homers and Dantes and Shakespeare's, all the centuries to come shall have successfully deposited their trophies in the forum of the world. By such a pile, we may hope to scale heaven at last. Like many people today, Thoreau was a religious seeker, open-minded, curious, and in search of wisdom, which is to say, peace of mind, inner freedom, and cosmic consciousness. For generations of people, not only in this country, but in other times and places as well, Thoreau has been a spiritual guide whose writings, Walden especially, belong with those mentioned above. He modeled the art of life, encouraging others not to follow him, but to find and pursue their own way. Contemporary seekers have been drawn to the teachings of Buddhism, Stoicism, and have practiced yoga, Tai Chi, mindfulness meditation in the same spirit as Thoreau. The lesson of these philosophies and religious practices is the same. In Haddo's words, an invitation to each human being to transform himself. Philosophy is a conversion, a transformation of one's way of being and living, and a quest for wisdom. This way was not for faint-hearted crusaders or those seeking amusement rather than enlightenment. It takes dedication and discipline. As Thoreau said about walking, you must be prepared to leave father and mother, brother and sister, wife and child and friends, and never see them again. He may have been exaggerating, but he wasn't kidding. Spinoza wrote the same at the end of his Ethics. If the way which I have pointed out as leading to this result seems exceedingly hard, it may nevertheless be discovered. It must indeed be hard, since it is so seldom found. How would it be possible if salvation were easy to find, and could without any great labor be found, that it should be neglected by almost everybody? But all excellent things are as difficult as they are rare. Thank you.
Before we turn to Thomas, just a quick heads up. I think we're unable to establish a connection to our colleague Xiujuan Yao. I'm sorry. She'll record her talk and we'll post that and make it available for people. And so please take advantage of that. Look for that email that will come out after the AG, and we'll welcome into the conversation. But thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks for your patience. We do our best. But now please join me in welcoming Thomas More. Thank you.
Good morning. So one of the things I must do today is let you know of a new book of mine that has just come out 2 days ago. And it's called, let me see, it's called The Cure at Walden Pond. The Cure at Walden Pond. And the word cure is important to me. I am a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, and every week, a few days every week, I sit with people who feel that their lives are not quite where they want them to be and where they feel unsettled. And I had the feeling, by the way, I am no expert on Thoreau whatsoever. That's not my role. I am someone who wants to encounter him and tell you what I find. So anyway, I talk to people there, and I get the impression that when Thoreau went to Walden, I often imagine him on that journey to Walden. That's a crucial moment to me, that he was looking for a cure. I think he was quite disturbed when he didn't know what to do with his life. It was quite a moment when people rejected his poetry. And I think that's disturbing, and I can identify with that. It took me a long time to find my way. And I identify very much with that moment in his life where he made a risk to make a movement where he might find a cure and discover himself. And also to find self-culture, which is such an important part of his work. So that word cure is important to me from that point of view. Cure at Walden Pond. For him and for us. I wanted to write this book today because I feel that the world needs a cure. And I know I'm not alone in that, especially here in this room. The world needs a cure. And it's especially meaningful to me to be in Concord today. Obviously, I sit in my home in New Hampshire writing and thinking about your place here almost every day as I work on the words of Thoreau. By the way, you know, I will mispronounce his name for you probably many times because I live out in the Hicks. You know, and my father was a plumber. It didn't give me the required background to be able to be appropriate for these things. But I would like to But I must say, I probably should say, this is my 32nd book, and I only wish my dad were here to read it. I would always send my new books to my father, the plumber, and if he couldn't understand it, I knew I made a mistake somewhere along the way. He would make a list of words that he never heard before and ask me to please not use those again. So I would like to read to you, as people are doing here, from the words of Thoreau himself. This is a quotation. My book, by the way, I'll explain to you. My book has 50 chapters. They're short, 5 pages each. And I begin with about a half a page quotation from Thoreau, and then attach about 4 to 5 pages of my own reaction and response to what he has said. So I'd like to read his passage to you. This is chapter 14 of my book, and a paragraph from my writing on it, just that much. So here's Thoreau. Perhaps on that spring morning when Adam and Eve were driven out of Eden, Walden Pond was already in existence. And even then, breaking up in a gentle spring rain, accompanied with mist and a southerly wind, and covered with myriads of ducks and geese, which had not heard of the fall, when such sure lakes sufficed then. The fall of Adam and Eve, of course. Even then it had commenced to rise and fall, and had clarified its waters, and colored them of the hue they now wear, and obtained a patent of heaven to be the only Walden Pond in the world, and distiller of celestial dews. Who knows in how many unremembered nations, literatures, this has been the Castalian fountain, or what nymphs presided over in the Golden Age. It is a gem of the first water, which Concord wears in her coronet. I don't know of more beautiful words for a very important theme. Let me just read you my first paragraph in response. Henry David Thoreau left home to live apart and observe quietly and intensely as the elements, nature, neighbors, silence, and even beings gave him hints about his place in the world. He discovered how to write about human values by living close to nature, seeing its ways through daily attention to animals, fish, and birds. Today, some people get a similar urge and go off by themselves to prepare for a new direction in life. I knew a man who followed his inner guide and went on a retreat for a full year before beginning his life in medicine. My 13 years of monastic study, from age 13 to 26, was a retreat of that kind for me, although I didn't understand it that way until later in life. Thoreau tells us why he chose a retreat at that moment. He wanted to live deliberately, not unconsciously, and at the end, he did not want to feel regret. So let's go back to those words of his. Perhaps that spring morning when Adam and Eve were driven out of Eden, Walden Pond was already in existence. I think it's so important that Thoreau connects Walden Pond with paradise, with Eden. That's such an important thing to do, because you see when you read him, any of his writings, that he was someone who could look at the most ordinary situation and see myth. Myth meaning a deeper story, a deeper place, a deeper thing, much deeper. He could penetrate through the surface of whatever it is was facing him and see another level altogether. And it seems to me if we want to read him correctly, or at least read him richly and gain from him, we also have to discover what that means, to be able to live and to see mythically. Or as the great Native American teacher, Black Elk, said, the point is to see in a sacred manner. I think what he was saying is very similar to what Thoreau was getting at. We can't see the way we all do. We tend to see what's before our eyes. We don't see what is beyond our eyesight. We don't see the within. So when I sit with a person talking about their daily life and how difficult it is, the only thing I can do to be of help is to see through them, is to have a different kind of eyesight, very much of the kind that Thoreau is talking about, to be able to see that when we are at Walden, I would say when we're at Concord, that is the place and the time to be able to see much more deeply than we usually do. Seems to me that our problems that are social, worldwide, the situation that America finds itself in today, which would be so disturbing to Emerson and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller and others, that requires us to be able to see mythically, to understand from Thoreau that we have to be able to see beyond what is given to us, what is just plain. And another way he did that, how many times did he say when he was paddling down a river that he was on the Ganges? He says that many times. He's on the Ganges. I don't think that's a poetic, flippant thing to say. I think it's part of his philosophy and his way of life, that nothing is not sacred. Nothing is not mythic in its reality and its importance. Let me just ask you, have you ever found yourself in Eden? Have you ever found yourself at a moment in life where things were starting over, where you had to renew? You had to take a break from where you've been and find yourself in Eden once again. Have you had that experience? I've had it several times. Sometimes I wish I hadn't had it so many times because it's kind of disorienting. But that feeling, I'm starting over. I can't do what I've done. Let me just give you one, or I'll give you more than one example probably. Once I start, I can't stop. So one example would be when I was 13 years old, I lived in a very intensely pious Roman Catholic, Romanist, if I may use that term, Catholic family. And it was just natural for me, this quiet young kid, to decide to become a priest. And in order to do that, I had to leave home, which was the most difficult thing because I had such a wonderful family. It's the last thing in the world I wanted to do. But I was overcome by some kind of a message. The Catholics say that the angel Gabriel comes and announces to you, you've got to have a different kind of life. Well, he came to me when I was 13, and I left home. And I spent 13 years, another 13 years, in monastic life. And I loved it. And I look back on it now, and I'm so grateful that I did that, even though I missed those years with my family. So that was a journey to me. In other words, I went from Detroit, where I grew up, to Chicago to enter this monastery. So Chicago was my Walden. I didn't go into nature. I don't really think, I know this might sound like a blasphemy to you, but I don't think nature is the main thing. I think the thing is that you find Walden in so many different ways. And I found a new world that I had to live in, and it was refreshing to me. If I hadn't left home, I probably would be a plumber today, which isn't a terrible thing. I admire my father, the plumber, so much. But what I'm saying is that when we do make a move, we may find ourselves over and over again in the Garden of Paradise, in the beginning of everything, when things are just starting. And where Thoreau says, he says, God still lives. That's such an important thing to say. In the biblical story of Adam and Eve, at the beginning, God is to be found. You can just go and talk to him. He's behind a tree somewhere until the snake appears, and then God goes away. But Thoreau says, when you are in Eden, God is there. And then later he says, when you go into nature, the important thing is to look for divinity, because divinity is lurking there, lurking. What a wonderful way to put it. I love the idea of a theology of lurking. So God is lurking, the divine is lurking in nature, and that's when you find your Walden. The divine will be lurking there, and it's up to you to find that. And part of your new life will be to be reconnected to divinity. The same divinity that Black Elk talks about, and the same divinity that the Native Americans say in their prayer, that you invoke the divine, the maker of trees. So if you wonder who God is, just remember, that's the one who made the trees. And you'll be close to, I think, our friend Thoreau, and you will have found what he was looking for, and I think what saved him and cured him. Thank you.
We are sorry to lose Xiujuan, but it means we have more time for conversation here. Mark Jolly will pass the mic around. So please raise your hand and we'll take all the questions we can.
Hello? Richard, I think it is a fantastic time to revisit muscular Christianity in Higginson. And I wondered if I'm sort of fascinated by, I think it has a lot to speak to today's moment, with the emphasis on masculinity and on the right as an element, also virtue, and, sometimes also mapped into the world, the evangelical world. And so I'm very curious if you have any thoughts on whether or not there's a real stark comparison there, or if there is actually some continuities. And if so, what are the continuities and connections that you see?
I think the big difference is that that for Higginson, it was important for both men and women to be doing that. From a very young age, he was an activist for women's rights. And then after the Civil War, once abolition had been accomplished, he, like other abolitionists, moved into the suffragist movement. And he was always very adamant about women being equal in absolutely everything. So not only was it different from the masculine Christianity at the time, I think it's just as different with what you were talking about, what's going on today with the right. The right, and this is my own opinion, the right is very he-manish, and so I think that He was really facing an uphill battle at the time because there were a lot of women who believed that it was a woman's place to be at home and to be raising the children and wearing the corsets. And a lot of them were not happy about it, of course, but they didn't really do anything about it. And Higginson was actively trying to say, look, you need to get out. You need to leave the corsets behind. You need to get fresh air. You know, when I was reading that, Louisa Alcott kept coming to mind. Because she was very active in believing in running and not wearing corsets. And Lucy Stone was the same way, who Higginson was very close to. So he saw women who were doing this, and he thought, well, if they can do it, anybody can do it. So.
I just have a follow-up question on that. What role did Higginson play in the YMCA and the YWCA movement?
Not very much. He thought that it was a good idea. He liked the idea that they existed. But I was unable to find him really being involved in founding anything. Being the transcendentalist, he's all about the individual. So he's not much of a joiner like Emerson and Thoreau were not much of joiners either. So he really believed that if you're going to change your body and your mind and your physicality, it's up to you to do it, however you want to do it.
I loved all these talks. And one of the things that I wanted to follow up with, Richard, is I'm so glad you're interested in Thomas Wentworth Higginson and his connection with the Transcendentalists. And one of the people that whose life he posthumously transformed was Emily Dickinson. And she wrote him in 1862 and said, "Are you too occupied to see if my verse is alive?" Because she believed that everything he was saying about women, he had the insight to see her in a kind of a editorial rescue situation. And he didn't at the time, but he was sort of enthralled in his own way, and he became very important to her. And I think the kind of way that you're talking about him connects with her in a different way, and it opens up a new kind of scholarship that connects all of them around this idea of gender and faith and how you live your life. So I'm very excited about what you're doing.
Thanks. He wrote an article for The Atlantic called A Letter to a Young Contributor in 1862. And basically it was a how-to, if you want to be a writer, here's how you do it, including stuff like start with fresh white paper and clean black ink, you know. And I always get the impression that he was really writing to women, to girl writers, more than anybody else. And the Dickinsons had a subscription to The Atlantic, and Emily read it. And so then she sent him his poetry. They corresponded for 15 years. They only met twice. And then after she passed, he was the only non-Amherst resident invited to her funeral. And he then about 15 years after that, with Mabel Loomis Todd, they brought out her first book of poetry. And so he was really active. Also, there were other writers, other women writers that he championed at the time. So he was really kind of practicing what he preached.
Hi, this is a question for Thomas. Thoreau's spirituality is a real genuine paradox because he speaks about it often as elevation, aspiration to a higher, purer state of consciousness. But he simultaneously speaks of it as a descent into his body and into the earth, into the vitality and wildness of nature. So you see both strands. And I'm curious which you think is dominant in Thoreau, if there is one that's dominant.
Well, I'm very happy with the ambiguity, and I don't want to go either way. What I like, what I particularly appreciate in him is that he does two things that are helpful to me. One is he sees the up and down all the time, the ravine and the top, not the top of the mountain, but he does ask you to look at mountains every day. But when he's talking about Monadnock, which is where I live on the mountain, Monadnock, just at the very bottom. And so I think I look at every day and think I'm doing what he told you to do. Look at Monadnock. I do. And but he says, don't climb to the top. He says, go halfway up or just go part way up. Get to know the mountain. Don't get excited about conquering the mountain. Don't go to the top. So I appreciate that. At the same time, and he says, when you're looking for a book in a bookshelf, stand on your tiptoes. Reach high. Don't go low. Don't lower yourself when you're selecting a book. I tell that to my readers all the time. Don't go after books that are beneath you. Of course, Thoreau makes that a joke in a way, that you stand on your tiptoes, reach high when you read. Don't stay in a mediocre place. So I appreciate those two directions that are kept in, they're sort of kept in tension all the time. Rilke, the poet Rilke, suggests in his Sonnets to Orpheus that we deal with a problem like that as though it's like a guitar or a string instrument, where you tune them by keeping both ends in tension. And it's the tension that makes the music. That's the way I look at it.
Probably a question for Barry, but to any of the panelists. I'm a little rusty with my Aristotle, but the question's about eudaimonia. I understand it to be a contentment, a whole life contentment that we approach by living virtuously and seeking excellence in that which makes us uniquely human. So there's the question for me. Aristotle would have told us that it's our reason that makes us uniquely human. The Buddhists might have told us that it's compassion that makes us uniquely human. Robin Wall Kimmerer of Braiding Sweetgrass would have told us that it's our capacity for gratitude that is unique in us. And I wonder what you think Henry Thoreau may have thought makes us uniquely human.
Well, eudaimonia means good demon. He, like Greeks, thought we were born with a genius and that it was important for us to find and follow that genius. And he says in Walden, no one ever went astray by following his or her genius. And it's by following one's genius that one lives a flourishing life. As long as we listen to the voices of others and voices of society, we're not living for ourselves. That notion of the demon or daimon is a frequent reference in Emerson's writing as well. And I think the whole essence of transcendentalism is following one's intuitions rather than one's reason. Now, they did talk about the eye of reason, which is kind of like a Neoplatonic notion, but it's the eye of reason is more like intuition than it is rationality as such.
Thank you all for an amazing panel. I have a question for Thomas. You've kind of answered this a little bit already, so I'm going to kind of try and take it a little bit further. I was also interested in the tension between, and particularly the tension between, with the title of your book, The Cure at Walden Pond, that kind of idea of stasis, a kind of achieving something, and your paper, The Way to Your Natural Self, Becoming an Original Person. So I was kind of interested from a spiritual, philosophical point of view, what happens if you find the cure? What happens if you get to Eden and stay there? And is that really what we're looking for?
No. No, you don't want to stay anywhere, especially Eden. No, it's a stopover. it's a temporary, perhaps it could be a temporary goal. I think there are moments when we give anything to start over or to find that place where the divine still exists, but you know the serpent's there. I mean, the story isn't finished when you're there. And when the serpent comes, I think you want to get out of there. It's probably a good thing that happens, you know, that you're not going to get stuck. I think people do get stuck. You know, they're looking for the right teacher, the right book, the right school of thought, the right community, the right place to live. And they don't realize that when you get there, you've got to keep going. That's not your literal goal. There's no such thing. A goal is only there to move you ahead, you know, to keep you going. So no, I don't think we should stay there. We get a cure, yes, I think we do get a cure of sorts. I like to think of the word cure not as a final fix. When I think of the word cure, I always think of when I grew up in Detroit, I lived across from Ontario. And when I'd go over to Ontario, I would see all these tobacco farms. And the tobacco was big leaves. And they were out hanging on fence posts and wires. And they were curing. They were curing. So that's the kind of cure I would like to find. We're going to find something that's going to bring out the best in us, bring out our flavor, give us a chance to be ourselves, which I think Walden was for Thoreau. It gave him the opportunity to find a way and to, for at least for a while, to discover who he was and what his potential was.
I'd like to add that, you know, Thoreau left Walden Pond. You know, he was living in his Eden for 2 years, and then he realized that he had other lives to live. I always say that there's a huge difference between the 27-year-old that moved there in 1845 and the guy that came out of there 2 years later. He became the Henry Thoreau that we're all honoring now. Before that, he was a 27-year-old who didn't know what the heck he wanted to do. And he thought he may want to write. So he found his Eden, it changed him, time to move on and do something else and take the lessons that he learned and put it into his daily life.
When you asked that question, the image that came to my mind, of all things, was that green light that Fitzgerald writes about, you know, in Great Gatsby. And he says, you know, we're always rowing, beating against the waves. I'm not sure that even though he lived at Walden Pond, that he actually found Walden Pond. I think he continued throughout his whole life, well, trying to reach it in a way, and that, at least in my view, it was always just a little bit out of reach. And I think that's probably true of a lot of us, you know, in terms of our aspirations in life. We may be moving in that direction, but somehow it's always just a little bit out of reach.
A while back, I was leading a birdwatching tour in the eastern and central Himalayas, and we came back from Darjeeling to Calcutta to catch a flight to Kathmandu. Who do I see in the waiting lounge, and the plane wasn't full? Mother Teresa. So I asked her if it's okay if I might join you for lunch, because it wasn't a crowded flight with my tour group. And she said that'd be delightful. So I get up and have lunch with her, and eventually she found out that I'm from Concord, Mass. She said she'd been to Boston a while back, and I sort of asked her, did you go to the Thoreau Hut or see Walden Pond or the Emerson, Hawthorne, Alcott House and all that stuff? And I got sort of a blank. I wasn't sure she even knew about Emerson and Thoreau. I mean, she's very brilliant ladies, great life history. So then I decided to check her out on one thing. I said, there are monotheistic religions that have one God, although in India there's many gods and some others, so forth. And I said, they're now finding Goldilocks planets are quite common among the gazillions of stars that are out there, and it's extremely likely that there is intelligent life on many of those Goldilocks planets, but they're light years away. My question to her, which stumped her, was, Is it the same God throughout all the universe, through light years, billions of years ago? Is it one God for every planet with intelligent life, or is there a separate God for each of those planets? And she could not answer that question to me, and I felt all right with that. But it was fascinating that the only place she visited in Concord, Mass. was the prison a mile west of here, talked to all of the boys about bringing God, our God for this planet, into their life when they get released. But it was a fascinating moment. Do any of you believe that is there one God in the whole universe, or does each planet have its own God light years away? And can this God keep track of 8 billion people and their happiness here and every other planet light years away? Is there one God or multiple gods planet by planet?
The worst one Sunday morning, and I'll tell you the answer.
Go to the church.
Peter's the only person ever going to tell
Gee whiz.
Well, your comment leads me back to Higginson. Higginson wrote an essay called the Sympathy of Religions. See, Emerson, Thoreau, Higginson, others kind of were being introduced to the world's religions, and it came to them more or less piecemeal. They didn't study it in a scholarly fashion. A lot of what they read was read kind of out of context, but they sensed that there was something common to all of these faiths. But the closer they looked, the more differences they saw. So they're trying to reconcile the differences that they see in different religions and philosophies with their quest for something that was perennial and universal. Now, I think there was another one, he wasn't a transcendentalist, but he said it wasn't a sympathy of religions, it was a symphony of religions. So they're wrestling with this notion that there might be something really common among all the world's religions. And I guess we're still working that one out.
It was the 1880s, 1890s. Higginson actually started giving that lecture like in the 1850s, to be a Unitarian minister talking about comparing Christianity with Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism. And then I think around 1900, there was a huge conference of religious leaders from around the world. I think it was in Chicago. And Swami Vivekananda, who basically brought Hinduism to the United States as an equal religion. He and Higginson, of course, talked and hung out. But it's, Thoreau, of course, is very aware of all these religions. He read lots of different religions. But you're right, Barry. I don't know if they really, was there one God? Was there lots of gods? Thoreau he says, Buddha, Krishna, the Oversoul, the Great Spirit. He's kind of insinuating that it's probably that spark of divinity that's inside all of us, just with a different name. Sure. Right.
Well, I'd like to bring my question back to Thomas More. It made me very happy you mentioned Black Elk. And personally, I think that the Native communities have a great record of philosophy and moral points of view. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about why you mentioned Black Elk. And I think you said something about his reference to living in a sacred manner and so forth. But I'm very interested that you brought up Black Elk. Well, I think the main thing is that personally, I have learned so much from Black Elk. When I was at Syracuse University working on a degree in religious studies, Black Elk was was a book that everyone was reading. Everyone at the time was reading Black Elk. And I could understand why when I read that book of his. When he says that in order to in order to get along as a human being, you have to see in a sacred manner. So you have to look at the world, look at life, look at everything in a sacred manner in order to see what is invisible from a secular vision. He's very much like William Blake. We could also talk about William Blake here. You know, if you could open the doors of perception, everything would be there, you know, if that's the point. So there are many people in our past, great teachers, who have told us that there's such a thing as ordinary sight, which is literal, factual, mechanical. And there's another kind of sight that is poetic, that is sacred, that is mythic. All these words point in a direction. None of them say really what's going on. They're not adequate. I find Black Elk to be helpful because he adds a dimension, especially in the context of what he's talking about, especially a ritual context. If we were going to meet all day here, I'd like to talk for a while about ritual in Thoreau, because he himself talked about and wrote about ritual and about sacrament. You know, we have a wonderful section where he says that his going for a swim and rising early and eating carefully are his sacraments. I take that very seriously. As a theologian, I take that seriously. So I think that Black Elk is one of the great theologians we have had, great religious teachers we have had in our history. And to leave him out of any discussion probably is a mistake. But I would say the same about Emily Dickinson. I think she's one of the great spiritual theologians of our history. And if we could treat her and Thoreau more in that line as myth makers and theologians, I think we would be closer to what they were doing.
Thank you. It's a comment almost more than a question, but when you guys were talking about finding Walden, I have this image, I always think in pictures, of Thoreau taking the rowboat out and measuring the depth and measuring every part that he could of Walden Pond and of examining the waters and what the waters contained and all of the living things. He was a scientist, and he folded everything into the one, into who he was, the whole. He was Walden Pond and more. He was the green light for me.
Well, we'll end it there. Thank you for that wonderful way to cap off a rich conversation. Thank you to Barry, to Thomas, to Richard. Truly wonderful panel. And we're sorry we missed out on Xiujuan Yao, Dr. Yao's presentation. We'll get that recorded and out on our email and Facebook page as soon as we can, probably like a little bit after the AG is wrapped up. Thank you again. We'll reconvene at 10:45.
Thank you, Barry. Oh, yeah. This will see you.
It's a pleasure. Share the soul change my life. I was reading Thoreau for 2 years before I read your book. And after 11 years of seminary, things started to come together with those two books. So thank you.
I know you from Holland.
Oh,
I was in a course.
Oh my goodness.
It's so good to see you. I like the way you, in your book about Christianity and
Oh my goodness.
how you
Isn't that great?
with the forefathers.
Let's be on the cover of your book.
Henry, was it okay? Nice to
Yeah,
meet you.
that was fun.
Henry Ford never went to get started, it never went to service. I've been working on a book about Ellery Channing, and you gave me the idea today